Hi, welcome to City Vision University's Introduction to Christian Addiction Counseling course. This is lesson 2. And on this lesson, we're going to talk about the levels of explanation framework and especially focus on Christian counselors in secular context. So, as mentioned, we're talking about 5 approaches to counseling in Christianity. And one of the key questions is, where do you work? So, most of the jobs are in secular context, and many Christian counselors are going to work for secular organizations, or many Christians in counseling or psychology might be working in what's called the public square, where you're publishing papers or books that are going to be intended for secular audiences. So that's really what this model is about. Now, Eric Johnson, who wrote the book Five Perspectives on Counseling in Christianity, he was very generous and allowed me to reuse some of his slides. So I have this statement down here adapted from slides. In many cases, I'm just using his slides as they are, but in other cases, I'm adding some of my modifications. But I want to add a little more detail. So the basic idea behind levels of explanation is that humans are best understood in terms of a hierarchy of levels or disciplines of relative complexity that should not be confused. So you have theology, psychology, biology, and chemistry. And to be honest, as someone who runs a university, I think the main reason why this is you have different departments, and the different departments like to kind of live in their own silos and not recognize that there's some overlap between these things. But basically, the levels of explanation is saying that each should be in its own domain and they shouldn't be disturbing each other. So therefore, one's faith shouldn't affect the other levels or disciplines. Now, there's a spectrum of, all Bible, no science, to all science, no Bible. The levels of explanation often goes more in the all science, no Bible, although not everyone in that space is going to support that. So now some of the strengths of the levels of explanation model is it takes science and research very seriously. So if you are a Christian and a very strong Christian and you're in psychology and you go to Harvard or some sort of, really high-end research university, you're probably going to have to follow this model because it's kind of following the phrase "my house, my rules." In a lot of these domains, you got to follow the rules that are there. So take science and research very seriously, and allow scientists to contribute to their discipline regardless of their worldview differences. So there's a lot of Christians who are the leaders in their field, and they're participating, regardless of their worldview differences. It avoids the problem with misinterpreting the Bible, like what happened regarding the Earth's position in the solar system, by just saying these issues are something that is dealt with in science, so that the Bible should never talk about those things. And it's shaped contemporary psychology in areas like psychology of religion, forgiveness, and values in therapy. So many of the top leaders in those fields, top people publishing books and papers, are Christians, and this has a big strength. Now, some of the weaknesses basically prevents worldviews from exercising influence. So a Christian worldview couldn't exercise influence because, like I said, my house, my rules. In this space, basically what you're doing is you're agreeing to follow a secularist worldview. Secularism is unfair to Christians. It forbids Christians to work within their worldview, prevents use of Christian values in public mental health facilities, and it excludes the Bible from contributing to psychology. The Bible has a wealth of wisdom that psychology could learn from, but it basically says that's off limits. Now, one of the most significant challenges to this is there's a heresy that a lot of people understand. One more thing is just it can easily lead to syncretism in the importance of modern values. If you're evangelical, then there's this tension on values like topics like homosexuality. So that's another shift. So now there's this heresy that's out there that people have called the dualism heresy, and what that is, it's the secular sacred divide, and the idea is that the secular world and the sacred world should never connect. So you have your personal beliefs and you leave your personal beliefs personal, and then you have your secular beliefs for counseling and psychology. Then you have your sacred beliefs for church and religion, and that shouldn't influence your science or vice versa. Your sacred's what you have on Sunday, and then you have the other 6 days. Now, R. Paul Stevens, who wrote a book called The Other 6 Days, said that the sacred secular dualism is the worst heresy of the Christian church worldwide. And the reason why it's a heresy is if you look at the Bible, it basically says the whole world is sacred and under God. So that's in Ephesians, Isaiah, and Psalm. Now, that's the big problem overall. In some of these passages, just to quote them, in Ephesians 6, it says, "There's one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all in all." And in Isaiah 6:3, it says, "And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And then Psalms 139:8, "If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there." Basically saying that God is everywhere and everything's, under God. Now, that's the big challenge with the levels of explanation. Now, what I want to do is I want to try to take something that uses some of the strengths of that, but also tries to minimize some of the weaknesses. So there's something called Christian systems theory. So there's a whole field called systems theory. And just like you can integrate counseling and psychology, you can integrate systems theory into Christian thought. So Christian systems theory, whenever I was at MIT, the department that I was in, I did a double major, but one of them was in the field of systems engineering. And what Christian systems theory is an attempt to translate levels of explanation into a Christian context that's more holistic and avoids this dualism problem. So even though a lot of this model I am supportive of, I recognize that all models are flawed, and there's sin built into all models and perspectives. All models have, they're a shade of sunglasses. So no area of science, society, or culture is perfectly neutral. It is essential to recognize, critique, and respond to the implicit ethics, forms of power, and or oppression embedded in them. So that's the Lausanne Declaration of Care and Counsel as mission, and recognize that all models are flawed. So even though I present this model, I think it's useful, it has flaws. So the strength is it helps students to understand all the dimensions of holistic treatment. The weaknesses is it can inadvertently cause students to view the Bible and theology as just one among many academic disciplines, rather than being more foundational lens or worldview from which to interpret other disciplines. So let me talk first about how universities are organized. As a university president, I have studied how the different topics are organized, the different disciplines, the different subjects. And one way of organizing them is to say that there are those that deal with things on the individual level and those that deal with things on the collective level. And then there are disciplines that do more the internal and the subjective domains, and those that look at the external. So now let me use some examples that will explain that. So the personal is, nurture, humanities, that might be the eye, the mind. The physical, that's nature, science and technology, the body. So looking at, things as if it's an it. So whenever you're studying medicine, you're looking at it as an it. The cultural, that's the we, the collective, and the societal, and that's the social sciences, that's the they. Looking at, others from the external, right? So you have different fields. You have the humanities, you have Western theology, you have ministry, you have art that's more a form of self-expression. Then over in the physical domain, you have biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, medicine, psychiatry, healthcare, life sciences. All those basically are looking at the body as if it's an it. And then that's really a worldview assumption, right? And then you have the cultural, gender studies, cultural studies, anthropology, ethics, non-Western religions and theology that's more collective oriented, music and worship and art for others, performance art. And then you have societal, and then you have the micro disciplines like microeconomics and organizational and business management, And then you have the macro disciplines like sociology, law, economics, history, ecology. Now, why is this important? Well, it's recognizing where counseling and psychology fit. In many ways, they're kind of in between these two. It likes to think of itself as a hard science, but it's not really as hard as it would like to be in terms of counseling and psychology. It kind of fits in between these domains. Now, what's important is to recognize how Christian worldview informs Christian universities. So a Christian, worldview, the idea of a Christian worldview is that's the lens that you interpret all these subjects through. And that means that you're not just saying, okay, theology is just in its own little box and we're not going to let it go anywhere else. It's saying that we have to have a worldview, and I'll talk more in other lessons about what the worldview is, what I mean by worldview. But we have to have a worldview that all these pieces of the puzzle fit in together. So now let me use an example of how this is helpful. Now, whenever we provide assessment of people in counseling or we provide treatment of people in counseling, studying counseling, you're going to get some tools, right? But the challenge is that you're only going to get tools within a certain domain. Sometimes you might need to have expertise on some of these levels because often, people will be affected by these levels. So let me just use an example. So a Christian systems approach to understanding causes of addiction. So if you're going to try to take an interdisciplinary approach to assessment, then that's going to take 4-quadrant approach. You're going to look at, okay, the individual, internal. So these are the things that they are most, responsible for themselves. So unemployment, lack of emotional intelligence might be a challenge that you have on someone, that you're working through with assessment. They might have personal isolation, broken relationships. They might have spiritual emptiness. They might have wounds or trauma from abuse. They have problems of separation from God. And that's within this quadrant. Now, this quadrant here, you might have the biochemistry of addiction. You might have medical treatments. You might have hereditary predisposition. They might work in an environment, whenever I worked at a Burger King where everyone did drugs, well, that's going to increase the chance that, you're going to do drugs, right? You have a lack of physical care of your body. So, you might be less, mentally healthy because you're not taking care of your body, and you might have a biophysical, emotional predisposition like to depression or things along those lines. So then culturally, you have cultural things that's going to affect this. So, a lot of men and a lot of cultures devalue emotion. They devalue the spiritual. They devalue relationships. We're so isolated in Western culture. We have this isolation problem, but it's also a cultural problem because we don't value relationships. You have subcultures where addiction is the norm. So like this Burger King where I worked at, everyone was on drugs. I also grew up in a neighborhood where everyone was sexually active at an extremely young age. And that, is going to lead people to addiction. Then you have the problem of drugs, alcohol, sex, food, materialism being promoted in the mass media. You have current cultural oppression. So that's, racism, et cetera. That's as opposed to historical. Then you have cultural inheritance from past oppression. So, many people have commented on a lot of the populations that have the highest rate of alcoholism and drug addiction often are populations that have been most oppressed historically. And there's this cultural inheritance aspect. And then, from a spiritual perspective, you essentially have worship of sex, hedonism, and other gods that permeate culture. So those are all cultural elements. And this is, the big picture, right? So then societal, you have the breakdown of the family. You have the lack of jobs. You have systemic oppression. So on one side, you might have cultural oppression. So say movies or, media that's causing oppression, or books or things like that. But then systemic would be, redlining whenever there's redlining, or police violence that's racially correlated and things along those lines. Then you have political priorities. You have the economics of drug trade. You have global exploitation. You have whole countries where there's failed states and government, and you have the globalization of crime. Now, you might have clients that could have any one of these that are, any combination of these that are components that are contributing to that. Now, why it's important, these are all different disciplines. Some of these are political, some of these are, cultural disciplines. And if you want to be able to do treatment, it's not just the field of counseling. This is why general education is important, because you want to be able to cover, all these domains. And so if you're going to come up with a treatment plan, so all that, okay, let's blame the system, blame, the person that, the point isn't to blame. The point is to get an assessment. What's really happening? What are the pressures that's causing this person? Or maybe not causing them is the wrong word, but that's impacting them, that's making it more difficult for them to get sober. And then you go into, causes of addiction. So getting a job, this is a treatment plan to address the causes of addiction. So getting a job, going to counseling, getting healthy friendships, forming their own identity, a positive identity, establishing physical and emotional safety, pursuing spiritual fulfillment, getting healing from wounds of abuse and trauma, and getting connected to God. And then here you could have getting assistance with physical needs, getting on proper psychotropic medication, removing access to the addictive item. I've had friends who they try to stop smoking and they have a carton of cigarettes in their house. Well, throw that away. That's a physical thing. One of the phrases used in recovery is HALT. If you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, these are physical things that can all increase your likelihood of being tempted or relapsing. And then cultural, as Christians, we're hoping for spiritual revival. You want to create subcultures that value the emotion, spiritual. Basically, you want a healthy church. You want a healthy community that values these things. You want to avoid subcultures where addiction is the norm. Avoid triggering mass media. So if you have sexual addiction, don't watch movies that are going to have a lot of things that's going to trigger you, or don't go to parties that might trigger you, or bars. Pursue groups that help to cope with cultural oppression. Pursue groups that positively address cultural inheritance from past oppression. So that might be positive, like a Black church, or a Latino or Latinx church. So, and immerse in culture that worships God. And then on the micro level, this is generally development, community development. So community development organizations, microeconomic development, macro. So that's going to be advocacy and structural change. So having just laws and policies, healthy social structures, just teaching of history, macroeconomic development. Now, you as a counselor, you may feel overwhelmed. Like, am I going to change all the laws? I'm going to do all these things. Well, as a counselor, you're only going to be able to do certain things. Now, it can be helpful to recognize all these, because whenever a client comes to you and they say, this cultural stuff's going on and that's really affecting me, if you deny that, then that's going to make it more difficult for them whenever they're feeling that pressure. Same thing with some of these laws. And if you're in a big organization in a city, then it can make a big difference to decrease access. So smoking is a good example where, the number of smokers in the United States has been cut in half. And part of that is they've decreased access largely through laws and advocacy. So that makes a big difference. So I'm just trying to explain how this Christian systems approach can be helpful in understanding treatment plans for addiction. So now, the next thing I want to talk about, especially for Christians working in secular context, is having a biblical understanding of authority. So, the first thing you got to think about is assess what authorities you're going to come under. Are you going to, if you're doing biblical or pastoral counseling, that's typically no licensing, but often under a church or denominational authority, or it might be ordination. Licensing, you're going to have a code of ethics that you have to follow. And there's going to be, the state, the employer, if you have a Christian employer or secular, you're going to have to follow their rules. Insurance has its own rules. Government reimbursement, like Medicaid, has its own rules. And once you decide whose authority you're going to come under, then honor that authority and follow it. So if you say you're going to be a licensed addiction counselor, you better follow the code of ethics for licensed addiction counselors. State licensing boards, NADAC, American Counseling Association. So that's more at the master's level. And same thing with your employer. They'll probably have an employee handbook that you need to sign. Same thing with government and insurance. They'll have you or your employer sign things that say you're going to follow their rules. And licensing and dominant forms of education and counseling is based in a secular worldview. So just recognize that and then decide, what are you willing to do? And ultimately, you have to follow biblical guidance on, secular versus Christian workplace. So, Romans 13 says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. And there's similar statements in 1 Peter and in Hebrews. Now, having said that, there are limits to those things. And this is, a complex topic. I'm not going to try to cover it thoroughly. But there's limits in civil disobedience. And you can look at Daniel as an example of that. You can look at Acts 4 and 5, where Peter and John are told that they shouldn't be evangelizing, and they say that they must obey God rather than men. And there's other biblical wisdom. What's your call and your role in the body of Christ? So some people are going to be called to be in the church and be a pastor. Some people are going to be called to work in secular environments and to be a Christian witness in that. And ultimately, you got to count the cost. Whatever you do, there's going to be a cost to that. There's a cost to pastors. I talk to pastor friends who say, it's hard for me to evangelize because I don't know any Christians because all I see are Christians in my church. And they, said, I thought about getting a secular job just so I could evangelize. And that's not a problem for someone who's working in a secular context. So now the next thing I want to talk about is the level of government authorities. And, there's some countries where you can't be a Christian. You can't have a Christian organization. So the most fundamental level is, do you have a legal right to exist? So there's plenty of, countries where Christians, you can't, be an overt Christian, or you can't have a Christian organization. And then within the U.S., Christian organizations and churches are tax exempt. There's a large portion of the world where churches are not tax exempt. And, just recognizing that those two things put you under a certain level of government authority. Then the next level above that would be, so you might work for a church, but if it has tax exempt status, then there's ways that the government can put pressure on the church. And right now it's not doing it that much, but in other countries they are. Then the next level is licensed counselors. And there you're basically saying that you're going to submit to state authority on you as an individual counselor. Then if you work for an organization that accepts insurance, and that could be a Christian organization or secular organization, then you're coming under the authority of the insurance company, and they may have codes that you have to follow. And then if you accept Medicaid or if you accept federal grants, then you're coming under federal authority. So I'm using the U.S. as an example, but if you're in another country, you could kind of think this through in your context. And then the next level is to be a licensed center. So there, typically it's mainly state authority, but there might be some federal guidelines that they have to follow also. And usually the way this works is a licensed center has to have licensed addiction counselors, and, all those things kind of build on each other. So all of this is important as you're thinking about, what is your call? What am I going to do? How am I going to submit to authority? We want to help give you guidelines. You can talk with your faculty. The faculty in your course will have experience in Christian, counseling and secular context, and, can provide and give you advice, on how to handle that. So if you have any questions, please ask them, and thank you for your time.